Hello everyone, I am Monica. In earlier video of A Room of One's Own written by Virginia Woolf, we have done first and second chapter of this work. This video covers the next chapters of this work. A Room of One's Own is not a novel, but it is a long essay based on lectures delivered by Virginia Woolf in Cambridge University in 1928. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Mary Benton, Mary Sutton, Mary Carmichael are the narrators of this work, but the name of narrator is not important because she represents every woman. Chapter 1st and 2nd attacks the closed Oxbridge system which treated women as second-class citizens, all the privileges that were open to men but closed to women. Many questions aroused in the narrator's mind about the closed elite system. Many questions like why did men drink wine and women water? Why was why was one sex so prosperous and the other so poor? What effect has poverty on fiction? What conditions are necessary for the creation of art? And this is the answer of all these questions. England was under the rule of patriarchy, and this is because men had the power and the money and the influence. Equal opportunities to education were denied. In that condition, how could women make progress? Woolf says that men could acquire the confidence, which is freedom to think of things in themselves, because their activity was given more status and importance than the activities of women. It is useless to ask such type of questions because there is no yardstick to measure the worth and value of one activity against another. Male dominance denied women equal rights and equal pay. If women had the economic power, they would be able to take on men on equal terms. So there were so many questions which arose in Virginia Woolf's mind, and to find out the answers of those questions, Woolf visits the British Museum. In chapter 3rd, Woolf visits the British Museum to try and find answers about the different fates of men and women. The great thing of this work is that this work is a balanced approach to the whole question of women's right and wrongs, and not a hysterical account of what is to be done. Fiction is like a spider's web, attached ever so lightly perhaps, but still attached to life at all four corners. So here Virginia Woolf compared fiction with spider web. Both are attached at all four corners. Woolf turns to an examination of Professor Trevelyan's History of England, which long held its place as the standard one volume history of the country. Wife beating was a recognized right of man and was practiced without shame by high as well as low. Similarly, the daughter who refused to marry the gentleman of her parents' choice was liable to be locked up, beaten, flung about the room without any show. Marriage was not an affair of personal affection but of family average, particularly in the upper class, and decisions took place while one or both of the parties was in the cradle, and marriage when they were scarcely out of the nurse charges. This was about 1470. 200 years later, it was still the exception for women of the upper and middle class to choose their own husbands, and when the husband has been assigned, he was lord and master, who will decide their future and their way of living. Now, reality. What was the condition of women in real life, and what type of condition of women any writer presented in his or her works? Imaginatively, women or woman is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. She is all but absent from history. She dominates the lives of kings and conquers in fiction. In fact, she was the slave of any boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. This is the irony. In literature, she is of the highest importance, but in reality is far away from that. Irony is that some of the most profound thoughts in literature fell from her lips, but in real life she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, was the property of her husband. So this is the irony. In 18th century, women exist in literature, but nothing is known what she did from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. Could she read and write? Could she go out into the world and strike out into her own? If she did try, she would have been cast out and described as lunatic. Lunatic means stupid. So she described as a stupid person. No woman could have written poetry, much less be a Shakespeare in those conditions. If anything came through, in spite of these conditions, it was a miracle. So it was very hard for women to come forward in those conditions and situations. Woolf continues her investigation into the position of women in the 16th and 17th century and the impediments that came in the way of expressing herself. Impediments means barriers. Here is an example of Lady Virginia, who was noble by birth and marriage. She was childless. She wrote poetry. She has to courage herself to write by supposing that what she writes will never be published. With all the obstacles, the mind was forced to anger and bitterness. Woolf moves on to the other women writers who faded away, like Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, and why neither of them could have written War and Peace because of the effect of poverty and chastity on female creativity. But whatever obstacle women had to face, including the constant discouragement and criticism, they were insignificant compared to the other difficulty which faced them when it came to putting their thoughts on paper. That is, they had no tradition behind them. In the concluding chapter, Woolf makes a passionate plea to women to come out and write to make their voice heard. Intellectual freedom depends on material things. Poetry depends on intellectual freedom. And women have always been poor, not for 200 years only, but from the beginning of time. Woolf ends on an optimistic note by giving the example of Shakespeare's sister. Shakespeare had a sister. She died young. She never wrote a word. She lies buried where the omnibuses stand now stop. Now my belief is that the poet who never wrote a word and was buried at the crossroads still lives. She lives in you. She lives in me and in many other women who are not here tonight, for they are washing up the dishes and putting the children to bed. But she lives, for great poets never die. They are continuing processes. They need only the opportunity to walk among us in the flesh. This opportunity is now coming within your power to give her. For my belief is that if we live another century or so on, I am talking of the common life, which is the real life, and not of the little separate lives which we live as individuals and have £500 a year each of us and rooms of our own. If we have the habit of freedom and the courage to write exactly what we think, the opportunity will come and the dead poet who was Shakespeare's sister will put on the body. And when she is born again, she will find it possible to live and write her poetry that we can't accept, for that would be impossible. But I maintain that she would come if we worked for her. So Woolf ends this work with an optimistic note. Thank you.